In June of 1944, as 150,000 Allied soldiers secretly prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history, a seemingly impossible problem threatened to destroy 2 years of meticulous planning. How could an invasion force the size of an entire city be hidden from the vigilant eyes of the Luftwaffe? The answer did not come from experienced generals or brilliant strategists, but from a young 22-year-old radio operator named Technical Sergeant James "Ghost" Morrison, whose revolutionary ghost communications protocol would forever transform the art of electronic warfare. The acrid smell of diesel oil mixed with sea salt hung over the English ports as thousands of military vehicles moved under the cover of darkness. Morrison, seated at his improvised radio station in an underground bunker in Dover, watched the green screens of his interception equipment with the concentration of a surgeon. His hands, calloused from months of operating communication equipment, danced over the controls with millimeter precision. This is the story of how a seemingly simple communications protocol, dubbed Operation Ghost, managed to make an entire division of 15,000 men and 3,000 vehicles completely disappear from German reconnaissance radars for 72 crucial hours. A discovery that not only saved thousands of lives, but fundamentally redefined how modern military forces think about electronic warfare and tactical deception. What Morrison discovered on those tense nights of May 1944 would challenge everything the military thought they knew about battlefield invisibility. To understand the magnitude of the challenge Morrison faced, it is essential to grasp the deadly sophistication of the German aerial reconnaissance system. In 1944, the Luftwaffe operated a network of more than 200 Focke-Wulf FW-189 Uhu and modified Messerschmitt Bf-109 reconnaissance aircraft, capable of photographing details as small as 6 inches high from 25,000 feet of altitude. These eyes in the sky conducted up to 150 daily reconnaissance missions over the English Channel, creating a real-time map of any significant military movement. Major Heinrich Kleist, a veteran Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot with over 300 missions over enemy territory, described the lethal efficiency of the German system in his diary. "We can detect a concentration of just 50 vehicles from 15 miles away. No army can hide from our eyes." German confidence was not unfounded. Their system had detected and thwarted 3 previous attempts at Allied troop concentration, resulting in devastating bombings that cost over 2,000 lives. Morrison, the son of a radio technician from Nebraska, had been recruited for the ultra-secret Fortitude South project after demonstrating exceptional skills in communications interception during basic training. His ability to identify patterns in enemy transmissions was considered almost supernatural by his superiors. Colonel David Strangeways, commander of the deception operation, recalled, "Morrison could listen to a German transmission for 30 seconds and tell us not only the approximate location, but also the operator's mood." The challenge seemed mathematically impossible. How could 15,000 men, 3,000 vehicles, 500 tanks, and 200 artillery pieces simply disappear from the eyes of an enemy who had perfected the art of aerial reconnaissance? The traditional answer, physical camouflage, had repeatedly failed. Camouflage nets could hide individual vehicles, but they were useless against the industrial scale of concentration required for D-Day. Morrison's epiphany came during a particularly tense night on May 15, 1944, when he intercepted a German transmission that would change everything. While monitoring Luftwaffe reconnaissance frequencies, he noticed something peculiar. German pilots did not rely solely on visual observation to confirm military concentrations. They used a sophisticated system of radio signal triangulation to verify and map enemy troop positions. "They are listening to our conversations as much as they are seeing us," Morrison murmured to his assistant, Corporal Tommy Richardson. The discovery was revolutionary. The Germans had developed a method of correlating visual observations with radio interceptions to create extremely accurate intelligence maps. Each military unit had a unique electronic signature based on the frequency, power, and patterns of its radio transmissions. Morrison realized that if he could manipulate this electronic signature, he could essentially move entire military units on the German mental map without physically moving a single soldier. The idea was audacious, to create a network of ghost transmitters that would simulate the presence of large military formations in locations completely different from their actual positions. Working 18 hours a day for 2 weeks, Morrison developed what he called the Ghost Protocol, a complex system of 47 low-power transmitters spread across an area of 200 square miles along the English coast. Each transmitter was programmed to perfectly imitate the communication patterns of specific units, command frequencies, identification codes, and even the characteristic intervals between transmissions that each radio operator unconsciously developed. The initial test was conducted with a single company of Sherman tanks. Morrison positioned his ghost transmitters 50 miles north of the tank's actual position, creating an identical electronic signature. When German reconnaissance planes flew over the area the next day, they reported a significant concentration of armored vehicles exactly where Morrison had planted his electronic ghosts, completely ignoring the real tanks. The success of the initial test generated skepticism among Allied commanders. General Omar Bradley, known for his pragmatic approach, openly questioned, "How can we bet 150,000 lives on radio tricks?" The pressure on Morrison was immense. Any failure would result not only in the invasion's failure, but potentially in the death of an entire generation of American and British soldiers. Morrison responded by dramatically expanding the scale of his operation. He recruited 23 specialized radio operators, each trained to perfectly imitate the transmission patterns of specific units. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a veteran operator from Boston, described the training. "Morrison made us study recordings of German operators until we could recognize each one by the footprint of their transmissions. It was like learning to recognize people by their breath." The Ghost Protocol evolved into a 3-layered deception system. The first layer consisted of high-power transmitters that simulated large military formations in Kent, 100 miles south of the actual concentration. The second layer created routine communications, chatter, weather reports, supply requests, administrative communications, that brought the ghost units to life. The third layer, the most sophisticated, simulated the movement patterns of the units, creating the illusion that the ghost forces were repositioning and preparing for operations. The operation required perfect synchronization. Morrison developed a detailed schedule where each ghost transmitter operated at specific times, creating the illusion of a natural cycle of military activity. During the day, transmissions simulated training and maintenance activity. At night, they shifted to movement and operational preparation patterns. The most ingenious aspect of the protocol was its ability to respond to German reconnaissance. Morrison had studied Luftwaffe flight patterns and programmed his transmitters to automatically increase activity whenever reconnaissance aircraft approached. This created the impression that the ghost units were reacting to the enemy's presence, dramatically increasing the credibility of the deception. On May 25, 1944, Morrison activated the Ghost Protocol at full scale for the first time. 47 transmitters spread across 200 square miles began transmitting simultaneously, creating the electronic signature of a complete invasion force in completely false positions. The tension in the command bunker was palpable. Everyone knew that the coming days would determine the fate of the most important operation of the war. The results were immediate and dramatic. Intercepted German communications showed increasing confusion among Wehrmacht intelligence analysts. Major Klaus Weber, head of the aerial reconnaissance section of Army Group B, reported in an intercepted memo, "We detected significant concentrations in 3 distinct locations, but visual observation confirms only limited activity. We request additional verification." Morrison had created a seemingly impossible problem for the Germans. Their eyes said one thing, but their ears said another. German military doctrine emphasized the correlation between visual and electronic intelligence. When the two did not coincide, the standard protocol was to assume that electronic intelligence was correct, as it was harder to falsify. For 72 crucial hours, while the true invasion force concentrated in ports along England's south coast, the Germans directed their reconnaissance resources to the ghost positions created by Morrison. More than 200 reconnaissance missions were wasted photographing empty fields, while 150,000 Allied soldiers prepared for the largest invasion in history just 50 miles away. Corporal Richardson, who had worked side by side with Morrison throughout the operation, recalled the tension of those days. Morrison did not sleep for 72 straight hours. He remained glued to the interception equipment, constantly adjusting the ghost transmitters based on German reactions. It was like watching a maestro conducting an invisible orchestra. The true test of the ghost protocol came on June 2nd, when a severe storm forced the postponement of D-Day for 24 hours. Morrison realized he needed to maintain the deception longer than planned, but his ghost transmitters were starting to show signs of wear. 3 units had failed during the storm, creating holes in the electronic signature that could alert the Germans. Working under extreme pressure, Morrison implemented what he called the Ghost Emergency Protocol. He redistributed transmissions from functional equipment to cover the gaps, creating denser communication patterns that simulated units consolidating before a major operation. Paradoxically, equipment failures made the deception more convincing. The Germans interpreted the intensified radio activity as final preparation for invasion. Major Kleist, the German reconnaissance pilot, flew his last mission over the ghost positions on June 5th, just hours before the actual invasion began. His report, intercepted by the Allies, confirmed the operation's total success. Significant enemy concentration confirmed in Kent. Estimate: 2 armored divisions, 1 infantry division. Preparation for imminent operations evident. While Kleist reported ghost troops, 150,000 real Allied soldiers embarked on invasion ships 100 miles away, completely invisible to German eyes. Morrison had achieved the impossible, making an entire army disappear using only radio waves and ingenuity. The tactical impact was devastating for the Germans. When the actual invasion began in Normandy on June 6th, German reserves were positioned to repel a ghost invasion that would never come. General Erwin Rommel, commander of the German coastal defenses, kept 2 panzer divisions in defensive positions based on Morrison's false electronic intelligence for up to 48 hours after the actual invasion began. In the early hours of D-Day, while Allied soldiers fought to establish beachheads in Normandy, Morrison continued operating his ghost transmitters to maintain German confusion. He had developed a ghost combat protocol that simulated a second imminent invasion, forcing the Germans to keep valuable resources defending empty beaches. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in his memoirs, "We constantly received contradictory reports. Our electronic intelligence indicated preparations for a second invasion in Kent, but visual reconnaissance did not confirm it. The confusion was total. This confusion cost the Germans precious hours that could have been used to reinforce the defenses of Normandy." Morrison realized he could amplify the confusion by creating echoes of his ghost transmissions. He programmed some transmitters to retransmit signals from others, creating the impression that the ghost units were communicating with each other and coordinating movements. This technique, which he called the ghost network, made the imaginary forces seem even more real and organized. The most impressive aspect of the operation was its resource efficiency. Morrison had immobilized 2 German divisions, approximately 30,000 soldiers and 400 tanks, using only 47 radio transmitters operated by 23 men. The total cost of Operation Ghost was less than $50,000, while the forces it neutralized were worth more than $200 million in equipment and training. During the first 3 days of the invasion, while the Allies fought to expand their beachheads, Morrison kept his ghost transmissions active 24 hours a day. He had created a rotating schedule where different ghost units became active at specific times, simulating a complex and constantly moving invasion force. Sergeant O'Brien recalled the intensity of those days. Morrison was literally fighting an electronic war against all of German intelligence. He adjusted frequencies, changed patterns, and created new units as needed. It was like watching a chess grandmaster playing against a dozen opponents simultaneously. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Morrison faced his greatest challenge when the Germans began to suspect the deception. Intercepted communications showed that German intelligence analysts were questioning the discrepancy between visual and electronic observation. Major Weber had ordered low-altitude photographic reconnaissance missions over the ghost positions, a technique that could completely expose the operation. Morrison responded with a desperate maneuver he called the Ghost Extinction Protocol. Instead of simply turning off the transmitters, he programmed them to simulate a gradual withdrawal of the ghost units. For 48 hours, transmissions progressively decreased, creating the impression that the ghost forces were moving to rear positions or being redistributed. This simulated withdrawal was perfectly timed with Allied intelligence reports on actual German troop movements. Morrison had studied German communication patterns and knew they would interpret the withdrawal of the ghost units as evidence that the Allies were consolidating forces in Normandy, exactly what was happening in reality. The last ghost transmitter was turned off on June 11th, ending one of the most successful deception operations in military history. For 6 crucial days, Morrison had kept 2 German divisions completely out of the real battle, allowing the Allies to establish a solid beachhead in continental Europe. The strategic impact of Operation Ghost was quantified in an ultra-secret Allied High Command report. The 2 German divisions immobilized by Morrison's deception could have caused between 15,000 and 25,000 additional Allied casualties if they had been employed in the defense of Normandy. Morrison had saved more lives in 6 days than many generals in entire campaigns. After the success in Normandy, Morrison was quickly promoted and assigned to develop electronic warfare protocols for the Pacific Theater. His experience with ghost transmissions proved equally valuable against the Japanese, who relied even more on radio interception for tactical intelligence than the Germans. In the Pacific, Morrison adapted his ghost protocol to the unique conditions of naval warfare. He developed floating transmitters that could simulate the electronic signature of entire fleets, creating ghost squadrons that completely confused Japanese naval intelligence. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, his ghost transmissions convinced the Japanese that an American task force was approaching from a completely different direction. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Forces, wrote in a confidential memo, "Sergeant Morrison's electronic deception techniques revolutionized our capacity for tactical surprise. He gave us the ability to be in 2 places at the same time." Morrison also trained a new generation of electronic warfare operators, establishing the first formal school of communications deception for the American Army. His methods were codified in manuals that remained classified for more than 30 years after the end of the war. The most impressive aspect of Morrison's legacy was his influence on the development of modern electronic warfare. His ghost transmission techniques evolved into the electronic countermeasures systems used in modern conflicts, where the ability to confuse and deceive enemy communication systems is considered as important as conventional firepower. In 1945, Morrison received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration, in a secret ceremony. The citation, declassified only in 1975, credited him with extraordinary contributions to the success of Allied operations through revolutionary innovations in electronic warfare and tactical deception. The true impact of Operation Ghost only became apparent years after the war, when captured German documents revealed the full extent of the confusion caused by Morrison. German intelligence reports from the days leading up to D-Day showed a completely distorted picture of Allied forces, with ghost units being tracked and analyzed as if they were real. General Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German High Command, admitted during the Nuremberg trials that Allied electronic deception had been more effective than any strategic bombing in neutralizing our response capability. This admission confirmed that Morrison had achieved something thousands of heavy bombers could not, completely paralyzing German decision-making. Post-war analyses revealed that the Germans had wasted more than 500 hours of reconnaissance flight pursuing Morrison's ghost units. These missions not only failed to detect the true invasion force, but also exposed valuable German aircraft to Allied anti-aircraft fire, resulting in the loss of 23 reconnaissance planes. Morrison continued refining his techniques after the war, working for the newly created CIA on classified electronic warfare projects during the Cold War. His innovations in communications deception were fundamental to the development of the first computer-based electronic warfare systems, establishing the theoretical foundations for modern cyber warfare. In 1960, Morrison discreetly published an academic article on theory of deception in military communications that became required reading in military academies worldwide. Although the article did not specifically mention Operation Ghost, military experts immediately recognized the principles developed during D-Day. Retired Colonel David Strangeways, who had commanded Morrison during the war, wrote in his memoirs, "Morrison not only won a battle or saved lives, he fundamentally changed how we think about war. He proved that the mind can be a more powerful weapon than any tank or bomber." In 1965, 20 years after the end of the war, Morrison was invited to an ultra-secret meeting at the Pentagon to discuss the application of his techniques to the emerging conflict in Vietnam. American generals were frustrated with their inability to locate and engage Viet Cong forces that seemed to disappear into the jungle after each attack. Morrison proposed a radical adaptation of his Ghost protocol for guerrilla warfare. Instead of creating ghost units to confuse the enemy, he suggested creating ghost silences, areas where American radio transmissions were deliberately suppressed to create the illusion that there was no military presence. This reverse technique would confuse the Viet Cong about the true positions of American forces. The project, codenamed Operation Whisper, was implemented on a limited scale in 1966. Morrison personally trained 50 radio operators specialized in communication suppression techniques. The results were promising. American units managed to carry out successful ambushes against Viet Cong forces that believed they were attacking empty positions. Unfortunately, the complex political nature of the Vietnamese conflict limited the effectiveness of Morrison's techniques. Unlike World War II, where military objectives were clear, Vietnam presented challenges that could not be resolved solely with tactical superiority. Morrison withdrew from the project in 1967, frustrated by the limitations imposed by political considerations. During a confidential interview in 1970, Morrison reflected on the differences between the conflicts. In World War II, our objective was to defeat an army. In Vietnam, we were trying to defeat an idea. Ghost transmissions can confuse soldiers, but they cannot change hearts and minds. This experience led Morrison to develop a new philosophy on electronic warfare, emphasizing that technology and tactics must always serve clear strategic objectives. His reflections on the limitations of military deception influenced a generation of military strategists. In 1975, when documents about Operation Ghost were finally declassified, Morrison emerged from obscurity to become a celebrated figure in the military intelligence community. Universities worldwide invited him to lecture on electronic warfare, and his techniques were studied in detail by military personnel from dozens of countries. Morrison used his newfound prominence to warn about the dangers of excessive reliance on military technology. In a famous lecture at the West Point Military Academy in 1976, he declared, "We create machines so sophisticated that we forget war is fundamentally about people making decisions under pressure. The most advanced technology is useless if we do not understand the human mind." This philosophy influenced the development of American military doctrines during the 1980s, when the focus shifted from pure technological superiority to the integration of human and technological factors. Morrison consulted for the Pentagon on the development of command and control systems that took into account human psychological limitations and tendencies. In 1980, Morrison established the Morrison Institute for Electronic Warfare Studies at Stanford University. Funded by an anonymous donation from the Department of Defense, the institute became the leading research center in military deception and psychological warfare, training experts who would serve in conflicts from the Gulf War to modern anti-terrorism operations. The Institute's work expanded beyond military applications to include cybersecurity and protection against disinformation. Morrison realized that the same principles used to confuse enemy armies could be applied to protect democratic societies against propaganda and information manipulation. Students at the Institute developed techniques to detect and neutralize disinformation campaigns, applying lessons learned in World War II to combat 21st-century threats. Morrison often observed, "The ghosts we created in 1944 were made of radio waves. Today's ghosts are made of bits and bytes, but the fundamental principles remain the same." In 1985, at 63 years old, Morrison was diagnosed with lung cancer, a result of decades of smoking cigarettes during tense military operations. Facing his mortality, he decided to write his complete memoirs, including details about operations that still remained classified. The manuscript, titled "Ghosts in the Machine: A Life in Electronic Warfare," was immediately confiscated by the American government. Morrison spent his final years fighting a legal battle to publish his memoirs, arguing that the public had a right to know the full story of how World War II was won. He hired lawyers specializing in freedom of information and spent months in government hearings defending his right to tell his own story. During this period, Morrison also secretly worked on a personal project, an encrypted communications system that could protect political dissidents in authoritarian regimes. Using principles developed during Operation Ghost, he created a communications network that was virtually impossible to detect or intercept. The system, which Morrison called the Freedom Network, was discreetly distributed to human rights groups in countries such as the Soviet Union, China, and Chile. Although Morrison never publicly admitted his involvement, documents declassified decades later revealed that his technology helped coordinate democratic movements that eventually overthrew several authoritarian regimes. In his last interviews, Morrison expressed satisfaction that his military techniques had found peaceful application. "I spent the war creating ghosts to confuse enemies. Now I am creating ghosts to protect freedom. It is an appropriate evolution." Morrison died on March 12, 1987, taking many secrets to the grave. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery, with full military honors and the presence of high-ranking officers from multiple Allied countries. After Morrison's death, his widow, Margaret, continued the legal battle to publish his memoirs. In 1991, with the end of the Cold War, the American government finally allowed the publication of an edited version of the manuscript. Ghosts in the Machine immediately became a bestseller and is considered one of the most important accounts of electronic warfare ever written. The book revealed for the first time many details about Operation Ghost and other classified operations by Morrison. Readers were fascinated by the technical description of how a young radio operator had managed to deceive the entire German intelligence machine using equipment that cost less than a single Sherman tank. Military critics praised the book for its honesty about the limitations and failures of deception operations. Morrison did not romanticize his achievements, admitting that many of his techniques failed and that success often depended as much on luck as skill. This honesty increased the book's credibility and its educational influence. The publication of Morrison's memoirs coincided with the dawn of the Internet era, and his electronic deception techniques gained new relevance. Cybersecurity experts recognized that the principles Morrison developed during World War II were directly applicable to protecting computer networks against attacks. Technology companies began recruiting veterans trained in Morrison's techniques to develop cybersecurity systems. The idea of creating honeypots, false systems designed to attract and confuse hackers, was a direct application of the Ghost Unit's concepts developed in 1944. In 1995, the Morrison Institute organized the first international conference on digital deception, bringing together military experts, academics, and cybersecurity professionals to discuss modern applications of Morrison's techniques. The conference became an annual event that continues to this day. In 2004, 60 years after D-Day, German veterans met with Allied experts at a historic conference on World War II deception operations. For the first time, German pilots like Major Kleist were able to hear full details about how they had been deceived by Operation Ghost. Kleist, then 89 years old, expressed admiration for the sophistication of the deception. "I flew over those ghost positions dozens of times. My eyes told me there was nothing there, but my radio instruments confirmed enemy presence. We trusted technology and were betrayed by our own confidence." His reaction exemplified how Morrison had exploited the German system's own strengths against them. The conference revealed that the Germans had developed their own electronic deception techniques, but never on the scale or sophistication achieved by Morrison. General Hans Speidel, who had served on Rommel's staff, admitted, "We completely underestimated Allied electronic warfare capability. We thought we were the masters of military technology, but we were outsmarted by a young American with improvised equipment." German documents presented at the conference showed that the confusion caused by Operation Ghost had extended far beyond the units directly deceived. Contradictory reports on Allied positions had created distrust among different branches of German intelligence, hindering coordination at strategic levels. The conference also revealed that Morrison had inadvertently influenced the development of post-war German tactics. German officers who survived the conflict carried lessons on electronic deception into their careers in NATO, contributing to the development of electronic warfare doctrines during the Cold War. Conference participants agreed that Operation Ghost represented a turning point in military history, marking the transition from industrial warfare to information warfare. Morrison had demonstrated that information control could be more powerful than material superiority. In 2014, 70 years after D-Day, the American National Security Agency declassified the last documents related to Operation Ghost. These documents revealed that Morrison had developed techniques even more advanced than previously known, including adaptive deception systems that could automatically modify their transmissions based on enemy reactions. The documents showed that Morrison had essentially created the first artificial intelligence system applied to electronic warfare. His ghost transmitters used primitive analog circuits to learn German reconnaissance patterns and adjust their transmissions to maximize deception. This technology was decades ahead of its time. Modern engineers who studied Morrison's schematics expressed admiration for the elegance of his solutions. Dr. Sarah Chen, an artificial intelligence expert from MIT, commented, "Morrison was doing machine learning with vacuum tubes and relays in 1944. His adaptive circuits are conceptually identical to the algorithms we use today, just implemented with the technology of the time." The revelation of these documents led to a complete reevaluation of Morrison's role in the history of technology. Technology historians began to argue that Morrison should be considered one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence, alongside figures like Alan Turing and John von Neumann. Universities worldwide began offering courses on Morrison techniques as part of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence curricula. Students learned how principles developed to deceive German radio operators could be applied to protect modern systems against cyber attacks. Morrison's influence expanded beyond military applications to include digital privacy protection and combating online disinformation. His techniques for creating electronic noise to mask real signals were adapted to protect communications of activists and journalists in authoritarian regimes. Today, more than 80 years after Operation Ghost, the techniques developed by Morrison continue to evolve and find new applications. Modern electronic warfare systems use artificial intelligence to create real-time deceptions, but the fundamental principles remain the same as those Morrison developed in his bunker in Dover. Technology companies employ deception engineers who study Morrison's techniques to develop security systems that can confuse and divert cyber attackers. The idea of creating electronic parallel realities to confuse adversaries has become a standard tool in digital security. Morrison's legacy also influences modern debates on ethics in warfare and technology. His techniques raise questions about the moral limits of military deception and the role of truth in conflicts. Military philosophers study Operation Ghost as a case study on when deception is justifiable in war. Human rights organizations have adapted Morrison's techniques to protect activists and dissidents. Communication networks based on ghost transmission principles allow opposition groups to coordinate activities without detection by authoritarian governments. Morrison's story also serves as inspiration for a new generation of military innovators. Young officers study how an ordinary soldier managed to revolutionize warfare through creative thinking and innovative application of existing technology. Military research centers worldwide maintain Morrison laboratories dedicated to developing new electronic deception techniques. These laboratories continue Morrison's pioneering work, adapting his principles for 21st-century threats. The most profound transformation caused by the Operation Ghost was not technological, but conceptual. Morrison proved that modern warfare is not just about destroying the enemy, but about controlling their perception of reality. This lesson fundamentally redefined how military personnel think about conflict and strategy. Before Morrison, electronic warfare was primarily seen as a tool for communication and coordination. After Operation Ghost, it was recognized as a strategic weapon capable of influencing the outcome of entire conflicts. This shift in perspective influenced the development of military doctrines for decades. Morrison's ability to hack the human mind through information manipulation anticipated many challenges of the digital age. His techniques for creating convincing false realities are studied today by researchers combating deepfakes and online disinformation. The most impressive aspect of Morrison's legacy is how his innovations transcended military applications to influence fields such as psychology, sociology, and philosophy. Academics study the Operation Ghost to understand how perceptions can be manipulated and how societies can protect themselves against systematic deception. Morrison demonstrated that the most powerful weapon is not necessarily the most destructive, but the most creative. His ability to solve seemingly impossible problems through innovative thinking continues to inspire problem solvers in all fields. Morrison's story also illustrates how determined individuals can change the course of history through innovation and perseverance. A young radio operator from Nebraska managed to influence the outcome of the greatest war in human history, proving that genius can emerge from the most unexpected places.